If you've got no sense of God covering your history, you'll wobble and fall. If you've got no sense of God being your supreme value, the same thing is going to happen. You're going to be wiped away in a society that is desperate to take what's most precious from you and destroy your value system. Well, thank you so very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all in Norway. I'm going to talk to you about a person who lived in 600 or so BC, so around 25 centuries ago. Why should we be interested? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, the main part of what I'm going to say is about Daniel as a young person and what he experienced essentially as a teenager, let's say between he was 15 and he was 20. He lived in a very narrow culture for the first part of his life. It was a monotheistic culture. It was a Jewish culture. And then suddenly, virtually overnight, he was taken by force many kilometers away to a completely different culture. The language was totally different. The legal system was totally different. The economic system was completely different. And so it goes on. It was a very powerful culture. And we can think of that and ask ourselves, why should it be important for us as young people in the 21st century to think about it at all? Now, I want to come to the central point right away, and it's this. Daniel was brought up in a God-fearing environment, that's clear. To the end of his life, he maintained devotion to God. It's clear that he prayed and he read his Bible. And that's very good. But there's something else he kept doing. You see, I've lived long enough to notice many people who still read their Bible. They go to church. They say their prayers. But long ago, they have lost the cutting edge of their public witness. They've been silenced by secular culture. Many of them have got scared so that their Christianity is done in private, either in the box that is their house or the box that is their church. And for years, they've never let other people know that they've been a Christian, that they are one. And what amazes me about this man, Daniel, and his three friends, is they did not simply maintain their devotion to God, but they maintained their witness. And so we're going to have a look and ask the question, Daniel, tell us, what was it kept you standing straight in public for all of your life, standing as a believer in God? Now, I say that he moved to the culture of Babylon, and I want you to get some idea of this, because Babylon was a spectacular city. It was the most swinging city in the world at the time. Babylon was advanced in music. It was advanced in art. It was advanced in engineering. It was light years ahead of Jerusalem. So you've got to think about these four young people coming to Babylon forcibly, but suddenly finding themselves enrolled in the top course in King's College Babylon, the university. And we're going to follow them there. Now, the Babylonians were brilliant people, and they developed language to a high degree. And one of the very interesting things about the book of Daniel is that it is written in two languages. There's Hebrew and Aramaic. Starts off in Hebrew, moves to Aramaic, and goes back to Hebrew. And what I think about it is this. Aramaic was the cultural language in Babylon of the day. Now, put together with that the fact that the book of Daniel is not all written by Daniel. Chapter 4 starts with the words, I, Nebuchadnezzar. He was the emperor. So perhaps with Daniel's help, he wrote the 4th chapter. And it is a remarkable testimony of how God came to Nebuchadnezzar's attention, and he came to believe, at least to a certain extent, in Daniel's God. That was the effect of Daniel's witness, and we look at it more carefully. But I just want you to get the broad facts before we go into the details. So the emperor comes to believe in God and writes about it in a language everybody could understand. So there is a sense in which the book of Daniel is the first evangelistic tract in the whole of history. And Daniel talks about the future to his day, that is the future in the 2nd century BC, in the time of the Greeks. And he gets it so accurately right that many people say, well, of course, Daniel didn't live when he claims he lived. He lived 400 years later. And there's no such thing as predicting the future in the biblical sense. So this faces us with a hugely important question today. As you know, I'm a mathematician. I work in the sciences. And one of the biggest objections to the whole of the Christian faith and the biblical revelation that I meet from people is, look, you cannot possibly believe this stuff. Because the central claim of Christianity to start with, that God became human, that is supernatural. And the supernatural doesn't happen. And this book of Daniel, he claims to predict the future. Don't be ridiculous. This is not possible. No one can know history in advance. Well, we shall see. It's good to anchor things in history. And this is the way they wrote newspapers and records in the ancient world. They wrote these cylinders. And these are the Babylonian Chronicles in the British Museum. And this one mentions the capture of Jerusalem in 507 BC. So we've historically inscribed cuneiform texts. Cuneos means a wedge. Cuneiform texts recording the events that are in Daniel. These are independent verifications of what is going on. So I'm going to give you the fastest run through Daniel you've ever seen in your lives. So fasten your seatbelts and let's go. Here is a table of contents of the book of Daniel. First of all, the story in the university where he refused the king's food. Secondly, in chapter 2, there's the story of Nebuchadnezzar's terrifying dream of a great image that came crashing down when a stone hit it. And thirdly, Nebuchadnezzar himself built a golden image. The dream had gone to his head. So he built a golden image, and he asked people, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to bow to it, and they refused. And then in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, and it's about him again, got very proud. And he was walking on the roof of Babylon, and he said, "Isn't this great Babylon that I built for my glory and my majesty?" And in that moment, he was cut down, exactly in fulfillment of a dream of a tree he'd had that was cut down. And he behaved like an animal, and he ate the grass, and his hair grew long, and his nails grew long for 7 years. And then God restored him. But in the next chapter 5, there's another king, Belshazzar, and he made a mockery of God. And he was mocking God at his banquet, Belshazzar's feast, where he brought the vessels from the temple of God and put them on his table. And a hand came out and wrote on the wall. And that night he was killed. And the empire of Babylon fell. Why that happened, we shall see. So there are 5 stories, one after the other, and they come to a huge climax at Belshazzar's feast and the end of the reign of the Babylonians. Now be careful here. Babylon remained the capital city as we move into chapter 6, because now the governing empire is Medo-Persia, but it's the same capital city. So we have a change of empire. It's like, in a way, Hong Kong was ruled by the British for a while, and now it's gone back to the Chinese. It's the same place, but different rulers. That's what happened here. Incidentally, Daniel is the only person in history of any kind who's ever run 2 empires. How do you rise to the top of 2 empires and not only maintain your faith in God, but maintain your witness to God? Well, we shall see. So now we're going to have a look at some detail, in case you're fed up with generalities. So let me read from the beginning of Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, who seems to have been the dean of students, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, just like at Oxford and Cambridge, which is probably where they got it from. They were to be educated for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. When he was a boy in Jerusalem, clearly he had a Jewish background. Presumably he went to synagogue with his father, and he'd heard the prophets. And again the prophets came, first to Israel and then to Judah and Daniel, saying, look, in your culture, you are compromising with the idolatrous interpretation of the universe that the Assyrians and Babylonians hold. You're playing with fire. And what's going to happen, God says, is that if you don't stop, that culture is going to engulf you. They didn't stop. And the culture engulfed them. So Daniel's own captivity, get this, because this is just amazing. His own captivity became evidence to him that God's word was being fulfilled. And our culture, folks, our culture is in huge danger. Each one of you, all of us, do you know you're only 2 clicks away from disaster on the internet? And some of you have been looking at stuff last night that you shouldn't have been. And you know it in your heart. Perhaps it's got a hold of you. That culture, the need to be connected to things that are very questionable. I wonder sometimes, do young people read the lyrics of the songs they buy? I do. And some of them are fearfully anti-God. And yet we think they're lovely tunes. Let's get it straight here. What happened at this time in history was a result of professing believers sinking into compromise with culture, at least secretly. And this generation, this world, this age, we're the most vulnerable because it's so easy to do everything in your own house without being seen. But you're being tracked. You're being tracked. So let's get this lesson, because it's a huge lesson, that when the disaster happened, it actually was evidence that God was behind history. And so Daniel accepted it. That was one of the things that really encouraged Daniel. But now there's something else. I didn't finish the sentence, you see. And this is the very odd thing. Because, you see, what happened was that sentence goes on. And how it goes on is that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand along with some of the vessels from the temple of God. Well, now, if you'd been writing Daniel, would you have put that in? By the way, Nebuchadnezzar took some of the pots and pans out of the temple. What? Now, being a mathematician and a scientist, things that look strange interest me. What on earth is Daniel wasting time talking about Nebuchadnezzar conquering the nation? Well, that was a big thing. And he doesn't say next, and he took me and my friends. No, the next thing he says, he took the vessels. And not only that, he details it. He said he took them into the house of his God, and he put them into the treasury of his God. We need to think about them. Because, you see, Babylon was a brilliant artistic city. If you go to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, you'll see it, at the British Museum in London. And in Daniel's day, they reckon there were about 1,137 temples. There were many museums connected with the temples. And as you know, museums in the world are usually full of they're usually full of all kinds of interesting artifacts that have been got from different parts of the world and not always paid for properly. But that's another thing. Well, let that be. But you see, he put these things into a museum. Now, why do you put things in a museum? Not because you don't respect them. The opposite. He valued them to a certain extent. So he put them into the treasure house of his God. And he was naive, like many of these monarchs. And you can just imagine the exhibition marked Jerusalem, and a big glass window and a little notice saying, I, Nebuchadnezzar, overcame this little country on the such and such and so. And here are some of the artifacts. Aren't they beautiful? Aren't I a clever king to overcome a nation like this? And there were dozens of them from all kinds of nations that he'd conquered. Now, let's ask what he was doing. What does this represent? And here's what it represents. Those vessels made of gold and silver from the temple of God represented absolute value. They were symbols of the glory of God. And to Daniel, they represented absolute value. Nebuchadnezzar made them of relative value. Do you recognize that in your culture? You see, Daniel's explaining to us the big issues. And he's saying, what I noticed in my life was that powerful people and not so powerful people take things of absolute value and they make them of relative value. And our culture is full of it. Because the influence of relativism from the ancient world has been to do exactly this. So people come to the foolish conclusion that there is no absolute truth, that there is no absolute value, that there is no absolute morality. That's very logically silly. Do you like logic? You think of the statement, there is no absolute truth. The person that says it expects you to take it as an absolute truth. So if there's no absolute truth, there's one absolute truth, and that is a contradiction in terms. Everybody believes that there's absolute truth, folks. Only usually not in areas that they think are unimportant. They believe in absolute truth about how much they have in the bank, but not about their morality. Now, what is this raising? It's raising the hugely important contemporary question of the relationship between the absolute and the relative. Is that vital to you? Of course it is. Because you have to decide where your values come from. I can imagine Daniel and his friends going down sometimes to the museum in Babylon quietly and going to the window where these lovely vessels were. And Daniel saying, guys, that's what we stand for. There's a Christian version of it. Maybe you've prayed it. Father, hallowed be your name. Your name be separate, be my supreme value. The basic Christian confession is what? Jesus Christ is Lord. He's my Lord. He's my supreme value. Your values are going to be tested tomorrow. How you value truth. Has everything you said about other people, or I've said about other people today, been accurate? 10% accurate? 60% accurate? Or do I not value truth? And so it goes on. This is a huge challenge, but it's showing the secret of standing. If you've got no sense of God covering your history, you'll wobble and fall. If you've got no sense of God being your supreme value, the same thing is going to happen. You're going to be wiped away in a society that is desperate to take what's most precious from you and destroy your value system. And then in chapter 3, he makes a golden image. And the three friends are ordered to bow down to the image. Now watch what's happening. In chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar relativizes the absolute. In chapter 3, he absolutizes the relative. That's what happens. You see, you can't live without absolutes. And if you take the true absolute of God and relativize him, in the end, you'll take something else and make an absolute out of it. Either it'll be money, sex, or power. And here it's the state. And so Nebuchadnezzar builds this huge golden, very valuable statue and says to men, you bow down to that. How would you have faced that? How would I have faced that? I've often thought of one of these men, now older, owning a palace with a job for life, with huge reserves of money in the bank. And suddenly Nebuchadnezzar announces to them that the following week he will expect them all to be down in the square at the town. And they will bow when the state symphony orchestra starts to play. They will bow to his image. Imagine going home to your wife and saying, I've got something to say to you. What is it, dear? You look a bit sad. Well, I am. Nebuchadnezzar has ordered us next week to come and bow down to a statue that he has erected. And it's just a statue of his God. Well, what's the big deal? I'm not going to do it. You're what? But what's going to happen? He's erected a furnace. Anybody that doesn't do it will be burned. But my husband, what about me? What about the children? I mean, haven't you taught us that there's nothing in these gods? And it's a huge sea of people. Nobody will notice if you just make a little, I'm not going to do it there. Wow. Do you know there are people in our world facing that choice right now? Can you imagine it? Before I finish this talk, they'll be in eternity with the Lord. Because they refuse to bow. This is values, folk. Daniel set his heart at the beginning. God was holy to him. And these three men, I'm amazed at them. They didn't know 1,000th part of what you know from the Bible. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they faced Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, King, listen. Our God is able to deliver us. But he might not. And we want you to know that even if he doesn't, we won't bow. That's magnificent, folks. Do you feel you've got that far? Wow. We need to think about these things. This is a message for our world. Where are your values? When you feel yourself under pressure from the internet or peer pressure to conform and do things that you don't really know what to do, we've got to look upwards. And see our value system enshrined in a person who bowed his head on a cross for you and me. I find it a huge challenge. I'm not speaking to you as some expert. What I'm doing is trying to share these big things in the hope that in your teens and in your 20s, you'll make some really big decisions. And I'm praying that this weekend, some of you are going to go out of here radically different in the terms of your commitment to God. Finally, why are the vessels important? Well, Belshazzar, they reappeared on his table. And those vessels destroyed his empire. That's why they're important. He valued God at 0. And God wrote, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. I value you at 0. It's very dramatic, isn't it? And taken all together, there are 5 lessons on values. We'll look at some of them again. Now I have a confession to make. The clock on this machine has stopped. And I think I've spoken for the right length of time. So if you want to hear any more, you better come tomorrow. Thank you very much.